Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up a file that at first glance looks like a pretty standard biography of an 18th-century playwright.
Right.
But once you start reading the source material, you realize we're actually looking at the blueprint for a cultural revolution.
It's so much more than just one man's life story.
Exactly. We are heading to the canals, the piazzas, and the bustling, chaotic theaters of Venice to talk about Carlo Goldoni.
It is a massive story, and Goldoni is such a fascinating figure because he didn't just write plays. He fundamentally rewired how an entire nation understood comedy.
That's a huge claim.
It is, but it's true. You often hear him referred to as the Italian Molière, although, and we'll get into this, he was actually quite humble about that comparison.
Oh, I'm sure. Molière that's a high bar.
It's the highest bar. But the title itself really hints at the scale of his impact. He is, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, the architect of Italian comedy as we know it today.
And when you use a word like architect, it implies he had to build something from the ground up.
Yeah.
Or maybe that he had to bulldoze something that was already there.
Precisely. That's a perfect way to put it. If we set the scene, we are in the Republic of Venice in the early 1700s. It's a time of decadence, of carnival, of masks.
The Venice we all picture. Baby.
Exactly. And the dominant form of entertainment was something called commedia dell'arte. And we're going to spend a lot of time unpacking that. But in short, it was improvised, it was raucous, it relied on stock characters and slapstick.
So not exactly highbrow literature.
Not at all. It was brilliant in its own way, don't get me wrong.
Okay.
But by the time Goldoni came along, it had become, well, often vulgar, repetitive, and just plain chaotic. Goldoni looked at this creative mess and decided he wanted to discipline it. He wanted to take that raw energy and channel it into scripted, character-driven works that reflected real life.
And that is the mission we are exploring today. How one man took the masks off the actors to show the real human faces underneath. But what I love about this story, and what really jumped out from the sources, is that Goldoni's own life was arguably more dramatic than anything he ever put on stage.
It really, really was. The man lived about 5 different lives.
Looking at the source material, which is primarily his own memoirs, so we'll have to take that with a grain of salt, and historical records, we have everything. We have expulsion from school for writing a libelous poem.
A classic.
We have him burning his own manuscripts in a fireplace in a fit of absolute rage. We have a bitter citywide rivalry that essentially drives him into self-exile.
And then, just to cap it all off, a truly tragic ending amidst the chaos of the French Revolution. It's an incredible arc.
It is. It's a life of constant reinvention.
He was a lawyer who didn't want to be a lawyer, a diplomat who wanted to be a playwright, and a revolutionary who was actually quite conservative in his personal values, a man of contradictions.
So let's unpack this life, starting from the very beginning, or I guess what Goldoni claims was the beginning, because we have a bit of an unreliable narrator situation here, don't we?
We certainly do. This is one of the most interesting things about him. Much of what we know about Goldoni's early life comes from his autobiography, his memoirs, which he wrote late in life in French.
Right. And by that point, he's had a lifetime to craft his own myth.
Exactly. And Goldoni, true to his profession, was a storyteller first and a historian a distant second. He paints this picture of himself as a born comedian. In his own words, he describes himself as careless, lighthearted, and resilient against fate.
So he wants us to see him as this charming, happy-go-lucky figure who was just destined for the stage from the moment he was born.
That's the narrative. But when you dig into the actual records, the public documents, the facts don't always line up with the story he tells about himself.
So where does this story start to fray? What's the first big discrepancy?
Well, it starts with something small but telling. For example, in his memoirs, he claims his father, Giulio Goldoni, was a physician.
Okay, a doctor. Respectable profession.
Very respectable. Physician sounds prestigious, university educated, but historical sources, parish records and the like, they suggest Giulio was actually an apothecary.
Basically a pharmacist.
Right. Still a skilled and necessary trade, but it doesn't carry quite the same status as a physician in 18th century Italy. So he's polishing the family crest a little bit,
A resume enhancement.
A little bit. But the biggest fact check moment, the one that really makes you question everything else, comes with his grandfather, Carlo Alessandro Goldoni.
His namesake.
The very same. In the memoirs, Goldoni writes this incredibly touching, formative narrative about how his grandfather introduced him to the theater. He describes his grandfather building a little puppet theater in the house, putting on plays, and how he sparked that initial flame of passion for the stage.
Which is a beautiful origin story. It gives him this artistic lineage. It
Right.
makes his destiny seem preordained.
It is beautiful. It's a perfect opening act for his life. It's also completely impossible. Because his grandfather died 4 years before Carlo was even born.
Get out of here. Really?
The records are clear. The man was dead.
Okay, so he's literally writing a character into his own backstory to make it more compelling. That's a very playwright thing to do.
Exactly. And I think that tells us something profound about Goldoni. He wasn't just documenting his life. He was crafting a narrative. He was a dramatist through and through. He understood that a hero needs an origin story, so he gave himself one.
And it also tells you he had a bit of an ego to put himself at the center of a story that starts before he's even born.
Oh, absolutely. But even if the grandfather story is complete fabrication, the obsession with theater itself was very, very real. The sources are clear on that. Even his parents couldn't stop it.
Right. The sources mention that while they tried to steer him toward more serious pursuits, law, medicine, what have you, his toys were puppets and his books were plays. He was just completely consumed by it.
And that obsession led to some very rebellious behavior early on. We absolutely have to talk about the Rimini incident.
Please. This sounds like something out of a coming-of-age movie.
It really does. So he's a teenager, maybe 13 or 14. His father, trying to give him a solid education, places him under the care of a philosopher named Caldini in the city of Rimini.
A philosopher. Okay, so we're talking logic, rhetoric.
The serious stuff. The idea is to give him a grounded, respectable education. But Goldoni, he's bored out of his mind. He's restless. He finds the philosophy dry and just life-draining. And then a company of strolling players, essentially a traveling theater troupe, comes through town.
And he runs away to join the circus.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
He completely abandons his studies with the philosopher, finds the acting troupe, and hops on their boat to get back to his mother in Chiozza. It's this magnetic pull of the stage. He just couldn't stay away.
Imagine the scene. A young boy supposed to be studying Aristotle, instead floating down the Adriatic coast with a bunch of probably very loud and rowdy actors.
It's the first great act of rebellion in a life full of them. But his father didn't give up on the whole serious education plan. Not by a long shot. In 1723, he manages to get Carlo into the Collegio Ghislieri in Pavia. And this place sounds intense.
What was it like?
Intense is the right word. It was a stern, almost monastic institution. They imposed the tonsure on students, meaning they had to shave the crowns of their heads like monks, and they were required to wear monastic habits.
Wow. So it's basically a religious boarding school meant to beat the worldliness out of
It
you.
was a place designed to suppress worldly distractions and enforce strict discipline, which, knowing Goldoni, seems like a recipe for absolute disaster.
Total mismatch. You're trying to contain a firecracker.
A total mismatch. And Goldoni relates in his memoirs that instead of studying theology or law as intended, he spent a considerable part of his time hiding in his room, devouring Greek and Latin comedies. He was physically in a monastery, but mentally he was in the Roman Colosseum watching Plautus.
He was studying, just not the curriculum they'd assigned. He was analyzing plot structures while everyone else was praying.
Exactly. And this all comes to a head with the great scandal of 1725. This is the moment that gets him kicked out for good.
This is the Colosso incident, right?
This is the infamous Colosso incident. So, in his third year at the college, Goldoni decides to flex his writing muscles. But he doesn't write a hymn or a legal brief. He writes a satirical, libelous poem called Il Colosso.
And who was the target of this satire?
This is where he really messes up. The targets were the daughters of specific, prominent local families in Pavia. He ridiculed them. He used all his wit and cleverness to mock their social standing, their behaviors, maybe even their looks.
Oof. In a strict religious boarding school environment, attacking the daughters of the local elite families that's bold.
It was incredibly foolish. You have to remember, these were powerful families. You just didn't do that. Now, there's also an alternative or perhaps additional theory mentioned in some sources that suggests the expulsion wasn't just about the poem.
There's more to this story.
There might be. There's a mention of a visit to a local brothel with some of his schoolmates.
So it might have been a combination of literary rebellion and good old-fashioned moral transgression.
It was likely both. The poem was the public offense. The other stuff might have been the final straw. Whatever the exact cause, the result was decisive. He was expelled from the Collegio Ghislieri and forced to leave the city of Pavia entirely. It was a humiliating exit. He was, for all intents and purposes, run out of town on a rail.
So he's kicked out of school, he's run away from a philosopher. At this point, you'd think he would just commit to the theater full-time. But he doesn't, does he? He pivots again.
He does, and this begins the phase of his life we can call the reluctant lawyer. Despite everything, he goes back to his studies. He feels the pressure of social expectation, of his family. He studies law at Udine and eventually manages to take his degree at the University of Modena.
And he wasn't just a student, he actually practiced law. He got a job.
He did. And he was successful at it. He worked as a law clerk in Chioggia and Feltre. He held what the sources call lucrative positions as a secretary and counselor. By all accounts, he had settled down. He was building a respectable bourgeois life for himself, the kind of life his father always wanted for him.
But the universe, or maybe just his own restless nature, kept pulling him back.
It's the classic tension, isn't it? The stability and respectability of the law versus the passion and chaos of the stage. An unexpected summons to Venice eventually pulled him back into the orbit of the theater for good. But before that, we have to touch on his romantic life, because that was just as chaotic as his academic one.
The outline mentions an unwanted marriage in 1732. What happened there?
Yes, so shortly after his father died in 1731, Goldoni found himself, let's say, cornered into a marriage proposal he really did not want.
An arranged marriage situation.
It seems like it. And in true Goldoni fashion, he didn't just say no or have a difficult adult conversation, he fled. He literally left the town in the middle of the night, escaped to Milan, and then on to Verona.
He really deals with conflict by running away, doesn't he? Runs away from Rimini, gets kicked out of Pavia, flees a marriage.
Avoidance was definitely a key strategy for him in his youth. But that flight to Verona turned out to be pivotal, because there he met a man named Giuseppe Eimer, who was a prominent theater manager.
And Eimer sees his potential.
He sees something in Goldoni, the wit, the charm, the knowledge of plays. He helps him become a comical poet for his troupe, and perhaps most importantly, introduces him to a young woman from Genoa named Nicoletta Conio.
Who would become his wife.
Yes, and unlike his previous romantic entanglements, this one stuck. They returned to Venice together, and she became a constant stabilizing partner in his very unstable life. She provided the anchor he needed. But professionally, Goldoni was about to face one of his biggest and most dramatic humiliations.
We are talking about the tragedy of Amalasuntha.
The infamous Amalasuntha. So Goldoni wanted to make a big splash in the Milan theater scene. He decided to write a tragedy, a serious, grand musical drama.
So he's aiming for the highest form of art at the time.
Exactly. He poured his heart into it. He meticulously followed all the classical rules, the rules of Aristotle and Horace that he'd studied. He thought he'd written a structurally perfect masterpiece.
He submits it to Count Prada, the director of the opera in Milan. And what was the feedback?
It was devastatingly polite, but absolutely brutal. Count Prada sat him down and told him essentially, "My dear Goldoni, your play is perfect according to the ancient Greek and Roman rules, but it completely fails the Italian rules."
What on earth does that mean, the Italian rules?
It meant that Goldoni had written a play for textbook, not for a living, breathing stage. Prada explained that in Italy, you don't just write a play in a vacuum. You have to account for the specific actors you have. You have to write for the composer who's setting it to music. You have to consider the stage decorators and what they can build.
So it's like a director today telling a screenwriter, "Great script, but our star actress refuses to say that line. We can't afford that explosion." And the composer hates the rhythm of that speech.
That is the perfect modern analogy. The theater was a collaborative, practical, and often ego-driven machine, not an abstract literary exercise. Goldoni had ignored all the practical realities of production.
And Goldoni's reaction to this critique is one of my favorite details in his entire biography. He doesn't argue. He doesn't go back and rewrite it.
No. His reaction is pure theater. He goes back to his inn, he orders a fire to be built in the brazier, and he throws the entire manuscript of Amalasuntha into the flames, one page at a time.
That is so incredibly dramatic.
It's theatrical. Even in his moment of failure, he's a dramatist. But it was a purging. It was a symbolic act. He realized the old way, or rather his purely academic approach, wasn't going to work. He needed to adapt to the real world of the stage.
And he did adapt pretty quickly. He wrote a play called Belisario in 1734, which was a huge hit.
It was very successful, yes. Though interestingly, Goldoni later claimed in his memoirs to be ashamed of it.
Why, if it was a hit?
I think because it was still playing by the old rules of melodrama and spectacle. It was a success with the audience, but perhaps it didn't meet the high artistic standards he was starting to develop for himself. He was beginning to see that he didn't just want to participate in Italian theater, he wanted to fix it.
This brings us right to the core of our deep dive, the theatrical revolution. To really understand what Goldoni did, We have to understand what he was fighting against. You mentioned commedia dell'arte earlier. Let's really break down what that was, the status quo he was trying to tear down.
Okay, so commedia dell'arte, which means comedy of the artists or comedy of the profession, was the dominant form of comedy. It had been around since the 16th century. It wasn't based on scripts. It was based on canovacci, which were basically loose plot outlines.
So there was no dialogue written down.
Very little, if any. The canovaccio might say, Arlecchino enters, sees Pantalon's money bag, and devises a plan to steal it. And that's it. The actors would have to improvise the entire scene.
Wow. So every performance was different.
Every single night was different, and the actors played stock characters. These weren't unique individuals, they were archetypes. You had Arlecchino, the foolish, acrobatic servant.
Harlequin, in English.
Right. Then you had Pantalone, the old greedy Venetian merchant. Il Dottore, the pompous, know-it-all academic from Bologna who spouts fake Latin. The boastful soldier, Il Capitano. The young lovers, the innamorati, who were the only ones who didn't wear masks.
So if you went to see a show, you knew exactly who these characters were before they even opened their mouths, just by their costumes and their masks?
Exactly. And the humor came from their interactions in a lot of physical comedy called Lazzi pre-rehearsed comic bits. An actor playing Arlecchino might have a famous lasso of the fly where he'd spend 5 minutes trying to swat a fly.
It sounds kind of like a live-action cartoon.
That's a great way to think about it. But by Goldoni's time, the tradition was getting tired. The improvisation often descended into repetitive gags, lazy and vulgar jokes, and the plots were these incredibly convoluted situations. It was what they called a comedy of an intrigue, focused on ridiculous situations rather than recognizable human behavior.
And Goldoni looked at this and thought, what? We can do better.
He thought, this isn't life. His great revolutionary goal was to supersede the comedy of masks with representations of actual life and manners. He believed that Italian life, the real interactions of shopkeepers, gondoliers, noblewomen, and servants in Venice, was worthy of art. He wanted to put a mirror up to society.
He wanted to show real behaviors, not just these cartoonish caricatures.
Precisely. But he was incredibly smart about it. He knew he couldn't just destroy commedia overnight. The audience loved the masks. The actors had built their entire careers on them. So he developed a kind of hybrid style to ease them into his new vision.
How did that work? What was the first step?
He started by taking the stock characters that everyone knew and loved, like Arlecchino and Pantalone, but he began writing down their lines. He would write out just the main character's part at first and let the others improvise around it.
So he's slowly introducing the idea of a script.
He's slowly taking control. Then he started giving them psychological depth. He'd give Pantalone a reason for his greed, or Arlecchino a moment of cleverness. He forced the actors to memorize speeches rather than just making up jokes on the fly.
That must have been a huge battle with the actors. I mean, imagine telling a brilliant improv comic that from now on they have to stick to a script.
It was a massive struggle. The actors resisted constantly. They felt constrained. They felt he was taking away their creative freedom. But Goldoni persisted. And by 1743, with the play La Donna di Garbo, The Woman of Grace, he had perfected it. This is considered the first true Italian comedy of this reformed kind. The actors were all speaking his words, and the characters were three-dimensional people. He had finally taken off the masks, metaphorically speaking.
We keep mentioning Molière. It's clear Goldoni saw him as the gold standard. He openly adopted him as a model, right?
He did. Molière was the benchmark for literary comedy in Europe. Goldoni used to whisper to himself, according to his memoirs, whenever one of his plays succeeded, good, but not yet Molière. He was constantly chasing that level of literary respectability and psychological insight.
But there is a distinction between them. The sources are careful to point out that Goldoni wasn't just copying Molière.
No, not at all. The expert consensus, and Goldoni's own work really bears this out, is that Goldoni's tone was gentler, more humane, maybe. Molière's comedy can be incredibly biting, cynical, sometimes deeply misanthropic. He really exposes the darkness in human nature.
He can be quite cruel to his characters.
He can. Goldoni, on the other hand, was more optimistic. He genuinely seemed to like people, even with all their flaws. He satirized their foolishness, their vanity, their greed, but he rarely condemned them entirely. There's a warmth and a fundamental sunniness in Goldoni that you don't always find in Molière.
Let's talk about the work itself. The sheer volume of it is staggering.
It is absolutely immense. We are talking about over 200 works, tragedies, tragic comedies, and over 50 opera librettos. Not to mention poetry and other writings. He was a machine.
How is he so prolific?
Well, he had to be. He wasn't a nobleman with a patron. He was a professional writer who lived off his pen. He worked with different theater managers, first Girolamo Medebach in Venice and Livorno, and later the powerful Vendramin family who ran the Teatro San Luca, and they demanded new material constantly.
And he had to churn these plays out to make a living. This wasn't a hobby.
Not at all. There was one famous, or infamous, season 1750 to 1751, where he got into a kind of public bet with his audience and promised to deliver 16 new comedies in a single year.
16 brand new plays. That's more than one a month. That sounds completely impossible.
And everyone thought it was. But he did it. He delivered all 16. It's an unimaginable level of output for a playwright today. And what's more, some of them were masterpieces that are still performed.
Okay, let's highlight some of those specific masterpieces. The one everyone has probably heard of, even if they don't know it's Goldoni, is The Servant of Two Masters.
Il servitore di due padroni, written in 1745. This is the perfect example of that hybrid style we were just discussing. It features the character Trufaldino, who is a version of Arlecchino, the classic Zanni or servant character. He's perpetually hungry, he's not the brightest, and he ends up getting hired by two different masters at the same time without either of them knowing.
It's a classic farce setup. How does he keep them from finding out about each other?
Through a series of increasingly frantic and hilarious schemes, he's constantly running back and forth, mixing up letters, serving two dinners at once. It's a masterclass in physical comedy and intricate plotting. But what Goldoni does is elevate it with brilliant, witty dialogue and a scripted structure that keeps the pacing absolutely relentless.
And this is the play that's been adapted so many times.
So many. Listeners might know the hit play One Man, Two Governors, which was a huge success at the National Theatre in London and then on Broadway. That is a direct modern adaptation of Goldoni.
That's incredible. From 1745 Venice to modern Broadway, the core jokes still land.
They do. Another key work, which shows a different side of him, is The Mistress of the Inn, or La Locandiera, from 1751. This is less about slapstick and more about character.
Who is the mistress?
The protagonist is a woman named Mirandolina. She's strong, she's clever, she's an independent business owner running an inn in Florence. And she is surrounded by men account, a marquis, a cynical knight who are all trying to win her affection.
And how does she handle them?
She masterfully manipulates all of them. She plays on their vanity, their class pretensions, their egos, all to teach them a lesson about the nature of women and love. It's a brilliant character study, a masterpiece of feminist wit, long, long before that term even existed.
And we can't forget his contribution to music. He wasn't just writing plays, he was a major force in opera.
Specifically, opera buffa, or comic opera. This is a crucial part of his legacy that sometimes gets overlooked. He collaborated extensively with the composer Baldassare Galuppi.
Galuppi, that's a big name in Baroque music.
A huge name. They were like the Rodgers and Hammerstein of 18th century Venice. They produced over 20 librettos together, and Goldoni brought his same reforming zeal to opera.
What was comic opera like before him?
Before Goldoni, comic opera was often just silly little interludes performed between the acts of a grand, serious opera. They were trifles. Goldoni took them seriously. He integrated elements of commedia with recognizable local and middle-class realities.
Yeah, characters singing about real-life problems, money, love, social climbing.
Exactly. Not just gods and ancient kings. Their biggest hit was Il filosofo di campagna, the country philosopher. It was a massive success all over Europe. It showed that opera could be funny, it could be musically sophisticated, and it could be socially relevant. He helped create a whole new genre.
Speaking of social relevance, let's dive deeper into the themes of his plays. You mentioned he wanted to show real life. In 18th century Venice, that meant dealing with class.
Absolutely. Goldoni is, in many ways, the first great dramatist of the emerging middle class, the bourgeoisie. His plays are filled with merchants, shopkeepers, lawyers, and their families. He dramatizes their lives, their values, their conflicts.
And what were those values that he seemed to champion?
Rationality, civility, humanism, a strong sense of honor, and above all, honesty. Goldoni championed the very bourgeois idea that a person's worth wasn't defined by their noble title, but by their character and their behavior.
So he was taking shots at the old aristocracy.
He was, but very carefully. He really disliked arrogance, intolerance, and the abuse of power. So he would often poke fun at the arrogant nobility, showing them as out of touch or vain or obsessed with their lineage. But, and this is very important, he also poked fun at the pauper who lacks dignity.
So he wasn't a radical trying to overturn the whole social order.
Not at all. He was a humanist criticizing bad behavior wherever he saw it, whether it was in a palace or in the street. He believed in a well-ordered society where everyone knew their place but also acted with decency and respect.
His characters aren't monsters of vice or saints of abstract virtue?
No, and that's the key to their realism. They occupy the middle ground of human temperament. They are flawed, but fundamentally relatable people trying to get by.
There's also a fascinating linguistic aspect to his work. We're reading this in English, obviously, but the original language he used on stage was a kind of battleground.
It absolutely was. You have to remember, Italy wasn't a unified country yet. The language varied wildly from region to region. The proper literary language was Tuscan, the language of Dante. But in Venice, people spoke the Venetian dialect.
And Goldoni used this on stage.
He used it brilliantly. His characters spoke based on their station in life. The local Venetians, the gondoliers, the servants, the shopkeepers, they all spoke in a lively, authentic Venetian dialect. The educated characters, or characters from other parts of Italy, would speak in the more formal, literary Tuscan.
So he was basically code switching on stage.
Yes, and in doing so, he helped legitimize the use of vernacular in high art. He showed that the everyday language of the people could be beautiful and expressive and worthy of the stage. Although it is interesting to note that later on, for the printed editions of his plays, he often translated the Venetian parts into Tuscan to reach a wider national audience.
What about religion? Venice was a staunchly Catholic state. Did that feature heavily in his plays?
Surprisingly, almost not at all. It's one of the most striking things about his work in Italy. He virtually ignores religious and ecclesiastical subjects. Despite his very Catholic upbringing and education, you don't see themes of death, sin, repentance, or theology. No priests or monks as main characters.
That seems like a very conscious choice.
It almost certainly was. He wanted to focus on the social world, the here and now, the human comedy, not the divine one. However, and this is a fascinating shift, later in his life, when he moved to France, his tone changed.
How so?
In France, he took on a much more direct anti-clerical stance. He wrote plays that openly satirized the hypocrisy of monks and the institutional church. It's as if leaving Italy freed him to address topics that were too sensitive back home.
Okay, so Goldoni is at the height of his powers in Venice. He's reformed the theater, he's writing hit after hit. But success, as we know, often breeds jealousy and backlash. And in the late 1750s, a major challenger appears on the scene.
Enter Carlo Goldoni.
This rivalry is legendary, Carlo Goldoni versus Carlo Goldoni. It sounds like a heavyweight title fight for the soul of Venetian theater.
That's exactly what it was. It was an ideological war. Goldoni was a nobleman, an intellectual, and he was a fierce, passionate defender of the traditional commedia dell'arte. He hated what Goldoni was doing to it.
What was his specific accusation? Why did he hate Goldoni's new realism so much?
Goldoni's argument, which he made very publicly and very aggressively, was that by removing the masks and focusing on the mundane realities of middle-class life, Goldoni was depriving the theater of the charms of poetry and imagination.
He thought Goldoni was making theater boring.
He thought Goldoni was making it pedestrian, too realistic. Goldoni believed that theater should be about magic, fantasy, poetry, and the bizarre. He wanted spectacle, not sociology.
So in response, Goldoni doubles down on the fantasy.
He does, in the most spectacular way possible.
Yeah.
As a direct challenge to Goldoni, Goldoni started writing these fiabe teatrali, theatrical fables, or fairy dramas. These were wild, magical plays based on children's fairy tales, filled with monsters, talking animals, sorcerers, and epic journeys.
And the painful part for Goldoni was, they were hugely successful.
They were massive, sensational hits. The Venetian audience, which had been lapping up Goldoni's realism, suddenly went crazy for Goldoni's escapist fantasies.
So the public taste just shifted on a dime. They started drifting away from Goldoni's realism and flocking to Goldoni's magic.
Yes. And Goldoni took this very, very personally. He was, in his own words, utterly disgusted with the tastes of his countrymen. He felt betrayed. He felt that he had worked for decades to elevate their theater, to give them truth and art, and in the end, they just wanted cheap fairy tales.
And this bitterness, this feeling of rejection, led to a pretty drastic decision.
It did. In 1761, Goldoni had had enough. He packed his bags. He accepted an invitation to work in Paris. He left Venice, the city he had defined for 2 decades. He left Italy for good.
That is such a huge move. He was in his mid-50s at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
To start over completely in a new country, a new language.
It was an incredibly bold and probably heartbreaking move, but Paris was the cultural capital of Europe, and he saw an opportunity. And initially, it went very well for him. He received a position at court. He was put in charge of the Théâtre Italien in Paris.
And he even had to switch languages professionally.
Yes, he started composing plays in French. And he wrote his famous memoirs in French. Imagine the incredible skill that takes to be the absolute master of Italian and Venetian dialect comedy, and then to pivot and try to conquer the French stage in French.
Did he have any big hits in France? Did he succeed?
He did. His play Le Bourru Bienfaisant, which translates to something like The Beneficent Bear or The Grumpy Saint, was a major success in 1771. It was even performed at the celebrations for the royal wedding.
Which royal wedding?
The marriage of the Dauphin, the future Louis VI, to a certain Austrian archduchess named Marie Antoinette.
Wow. So Goldoni was right there at the very center of the French royal circle just before everything fell apart.
Right at the peak of the Ancien Regime, and he was rewarded for it. He got royal patronage. He retired to Versailles in 1769 with a generous pension from the king. He was even teaching Italian to the royal princesses. It really seemed like the perfect, comfortable, prestigious end to a very tumultuous life.
But history had one more massive, brutal twist in store.
The French Revolution.
Goldoni is living this comfortable retirement on a pension from the king, and then the king is overthrown, and the entire system that supports him is dismantled.
Exactly. The new revolutionary government saw his pension as a relic of royal extravagance. The revolution stripped him of his royal pension. He was seen as a dependent of the old, corrupt regime.
And so suddenly, in his 80s, Goldoni was plunged into poverty.
Complete poverty. It is absolutely heartbreaking. The man who championed the values of the rising middle class and the importance of honesty ends up a penniless victim of a revolution that claimed to support those very things.
The ironies are just devastating.
It gets worse. He died in poverty on February 6, 1793. But the tragic irony gets even sharper, even more painful.
How so?
The day after he died, the National Convention, the revolutionary government, actually voted to restore his pension. A motion was brought to the floor. They recognized his immense artistic contribution to France and Italy.
That's incredible.
They voted to restore it on February 7th, the day after his death.
Oh, wow. A day too late.
One day too late for him. However, the story has a small, bittersweet coda. The pension was restored to his widow, Nicoletta. The poet, André Chenier, who would himself be guillotined a year later, by the way, pleaded her case to the convention. And his words are haunting. They're quoted in the sources.
What did he say?
He said, "She is old. Her husband has left her no heritage save his illustrious name, his virtues, and his poverty."
His illustrious name, his virtues, and his poverty. That is a powerful and perfect epitaph.
It really sums up his entire life. He gave everything to his art. He enriched the culture of Italy and France beyond measure. But he didn't enrich himself. He died with nothing but his name.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, how do we summarize the incredible legacy of Carlo Goldoni? What was the lasting impact?
I think most fundamentally, Goldoni gave Italy a classical form of comedy. He took a tradition that was based on improvisation, which is wonderful, but also fleeting. It disappears once the show is over. And he turned it into literature. He created plays that could be read, studied, translated, and performed for centuries.
He moved theater from being just a momentary performance to being a lasting text.
Exactly. And in doing that, he proved that comedy could be about real people in real life. He paved the way for modern sitcoms, for domestic dramas, for any kind of storytelling that finds the humor and the pathos in the everyday struggles of normal people. Without Goldoni, we don't get that crucial shift toward realism in Italian culture.
And as we've seen with things like One Man, Two Governors, his jokes, his situations, they still land. 250 years later, people are still laughing at the comic predicaments he constructed.
That is the ultimate test of a great comedian, isn't it? Does it still play? With Goldoni, the answer is a resounding yes.
It just makes you think about the cost of that innovation. We discussed it. He achieved his artistic revolution, he changed the art form forever, but he ended his life in exile, feeling rejected by his home city, and died poor, caught in the gears of a political storm he had absolutely nothing to do with.
It's the tragedy often hidden behind the comedy. The so-called Italian Molière had a life that was, in the end, far more tragic than many of his plays.
So here is a final thought for you to chew on as we finish. Goldoni spent his entire career trying to remove the masks from the actors on stage. He wanted to show real life, with all its imperfections, all its flaws. He fought against the stylized, fake personas of the commedia dell'arte.
Right. His whole project was about authenticity.
So in today's world, a world where we are all obsessed with curating our identities, with social media filters, edited photos, carefully crafted online personas that show only our best side, are we just putting the masks back on?
That is a very provocative question. You're saying we've created a kind of digital commedia dell'arte for ourselves.
Maybe. I think Goldoni might argue that true comedy, And maybe true humanity only happens when we show our actual faces, when we let the audience and each other see the flaws, the awkwardness, that middle ground of human temperament you mentioned. Maybe what we need is a new Goldoni to come along and remind us that the most interesting and funniest character we could ever play is just ourselves.
I think he would absolutely agree. The mask, whether it's made of leather or pixels, hides the truth. And for Goldoni, truth was the only thing worth watching.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the incredible life of Carlo Goldoni. We will see you next time.